Welcome to this YSL tutorial on SQL Server Reporting Services 2016. This video is going to explain how to use both shared and embedded datasets in your reports. So a dataset is essential to developing any kind of report to display some data. We'll start by looking at how you can create an embedded dataset, and we'll look at a couple of different techniques you can use to populate that dataset. We'll look at writing basic SQL select statements or SQL queries versus using the Query Designer tool, which is a kind of shortcut, cheat kind of way to do it. We'll then look at how you can create a basic report using a dataset and then look at what that looks like when you've deployed it to a report server. Once we've done that, we'll look at how you can then configure both a shared data source and a shared dataset. You need a shared data source in order to create a shared dataset in the first place, which is why we'll look at both. We'll then use your shared dataset in multiple different reports, so we'll create several reports using the shared dataset, which is kind of the whole point of creating shared datasets in the first place, before we finally move on to deploying the shared dataset to the report server along with the reports that use it, and then talk a little bit about how you can make sure that your shared datasets can be overwritten should you need to make changes to them, before we wrap up with one little explanation of a tiny potential issue with using shared datasets. So quite a lot to get through in this video. Let's get started. To follow along with this video, I'm going to assume that you've already got some of the basic tools installed that you'll need to create brand new report projects. So if you haven't done this already, we do have a short video series that explains how to get started in SQL Server 2016. And of course, you'll need to have installed SQL Server itself, along with some of the management tools. So these first two videos explain how to do that. You'll also need a copy of the YSL Movies database if you want to use exactly the same data I'm working on in this video. And there's a script in that video's description that you can download and run to create the database. That video explains exactly how to do that. And finally, of course, you'll need to make sure that you've got SQL Server Data Tools installed. So I'm going to assume that you've done all that already, and if so, what we're going to do is jump straight into Visual Studio and create a brand new report project. So if I open up Visual Studio 2015 from my Start menu shortcut, when the application loads, we're going to choose to create a brand new report server project. So I'm going to click the new project link on the top left hand corner, and then when the dialog box appears, choose Business Intelligence, Report Server Project. We can give this a sensible name if we like. Let's change its name so it's called Movies, because the project is going to be all about movie data. I'm going to store this on my desktop, and if I just click OK, that will go away and create my brand new report server project. The next thing we'll need is a brand new blank report. So let's create one of those using the Solution Explorer window. We can just right click on the reports folder and we'll choose Add New Item rather than Add New Report. Add New Report just launches a wizard to try to help you create a report. We're going to choose Add New Item and then select a blank report from our list of templates. So we can choose the report template. We don't really need to give this report a name. I'll leave it called Report 1. Click the Add button and we'll end up in a brand new blank report. Now if I want to create data sets, then of course I'll need first of all a connection to my database or a data source. So let's create an embedded data source in this report. I'll use the report data window, which if you can't see, just make sure you've clicked somewhere in the report design area, head to the view menu and choose report data. There's also a keyboard shortcut there of course. And what we're going to do is connect to our standard SQL 2016 training instance and connect to our movies database. So I can right click on my data sources folder and choose add data source. We're creating an embedded data source here rather than a shared one. If you want to know a bit more about embedded and shared data sources, the previous video in this series explains all about that. So I'm going to call this one something simple like Movies Embedded, and then I'm going to connect to a SQL Server instance. I'm going to click my Edit button to help me build my connection string rather than typing it out from scratch. I'll type in my server name. My SQL Server is currently installed on the machine I'm working on, so a shortcut to the local host or the local machine is // then I can type in the name of the instance, which is SQL 2016 training, and this is bearing in mind that I'm following all the settings applied to the SQL Server instance that I installed in this initial video in this Getting Started series, so that's why I'm using all these settings. What I'm then going to do is choose the Movies database from the drop down list. There's several other databases I could choose from, but Movies is the one I'm going to go for here. I'll click Test Connection just to make myself feel better, and I do, so I can click OK again, click OK one final time, and I'm now finally ready to start creating a data set. Now there are two main types of dataset you can create in reporting services. One's referred to as an embedded dataset, and you create those in the Datasets folder of the report data window. An embedded dataset is only available to the single report in which it's created. Alternatively, you could create something called a shared dataset, and you create those in the Shared Datasets folder, unsurprisingly, in the Solution Explorer window. A shared dataset can be accessed by any report in the same project. We're going to start by creating an embedded dataset, and one way to do that is to right-click on the Datasets folder and then choose the obvious sounding and only available option, Add Dataset. When I do that, I'm asked for which type of dataset I'd like to create. Do I want to create a shared one or an embedded one? To create an embedded one, I'm going to choose the user dataset embedded in my report, and then I have to select which data source I would like it to use. So I've got a data source here called Movies Embedded. If I select the drop-down list, I'll have access to that one. I could give the dataset a sensible name and then actually build the query which will return some data. Now that's one simple way to get started with a dataset. I'm actually going to cancel out of this dialog box at this point. One small problem with having to right-click on the Datasets folder and then choose Add Dataset is you have to choose exactly which type you're creating in the first place. It's often slightly quicker to avoid doing that and instead go straight to the data source on which your data set will be based. So I've created this Movies Embedded data source. I know that all of my data sets in this particular report are going to be based on it. If I simply right click on that data source and choose Add Dataset, I'm then going to be presented with the same dialog box but with a few things filled in for me. Because I've selected an embedded data source, I can only create an embedded dataset. That one is selected for me automatically. The data source itself is selected automatically, so all I need to do at this point is change the name of the dataset. Let's call it something like film data, and then I can start building up the query with the minimum amount of options to change. Now there are several different ways you could choose to populate your dataset, but essentially what we need to do is execute some kind of query that returns a set of data that can then be presented in the report. The most common type of query you're likely to write is based on a text query. So one way to do that, a fairly simplistic way to do it, is just to click into the big query box, and if you know your SQL code quite well, you can simply write out an SQL select statement. So for instance, if I know that there's a table in my database called film, I could say select. I'm sorry I can't increase the font size here, but you might just about be able to make this out. I could say select and then type in an asterisk or a star. Just don't let your DB admins know that you're doing this. Select asterisk from film. So that's one fairly simple basic way to select all the columns from a specific table. In the real world, don't let your DB admins catch you doing this sort of thing. Never select all the columns from a table. You should always be very specific about exactly which columns you should select. So what I could do if I know the names of the columns is I could replace those. I could say select title, followed by a comma, and then I know there's another column in my database called release date, and then I know there's another column called run time minutes. So as long as I know my columns and I know my SQL syntax quite well, I can happily write out a basic select statement. Once I've done that, I can click OK, and what I should see at that point is that my dataset has been created, called film data, with my 3 basic columns that I've selected. Now that approach works perfectly well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with writing your SQL select statements directly into the Dataset Properties dialog box. However, of course, it does mean that you need to know the structure of your database very well, and you will need to be confident in writing SQL select statements. We do have a short video series on writing SQL Server queries, so if you really wanted to get a handle on that, then we have a video series that explains exactly how to go about doing it. But there is an alternative approach as well. If you didn't want to have to learn how to write SQL select statements, you can create datasets using a basic query designer. So the idea behind this, let's create a separate dataset from this original one. Let's right click on my Movies Embedded data source and then choose Add Dataset again. Let's change the name of this one so that it's called, let's call it Film and Director Data. So what we'll do with this one is we'll pick a couple of different tables, which means if we were writing out our select statement in the query box here, we need to know how to write join code, which makes things a lot more complicated. So instead of doing all that, still going with a text query type, what we can do instead is launch the Query Designer using the Query Designer button. Now using the Query Designer is a much more convenient way to write long, complicated queries. What we need to do to start with is pick some tables, and you can do that in a couple of different ways. There's an Add Table button here on the toolbar at the top right hand corner. Alternatively, you can just right click into the background of the top panel in the dialog box, and then you can choose Add Table, and both options there, either clicking that button or choosing the option I've just shown you, will present you with a list of all of the tables in your underlying database. So rather than having to write all this out, what I can do here is select the tables that I'm interested in. So in this case I want to choose both the director and the film tables, and I can add those in by just double clicking on their names. Once I've finished picking tables, all I need to do at that point is close down the dialog box. If you added in a table by mistake, you can always right click onto it and choose remove. To add it back in again, you can either right click and choose Add Table, or again just click on the Add Table button and then just double click on the table that you do want, and that will be included. Once I've closed down the dialog box, I'll get a little diagrammatic representation of my query. So it shows me the tables that I've selected. I can click and drag to move those around. I can resize them. I can change the size of the dialog box as well, of course, and reposition that just to give myself a bit more space. The join between the two tables, this relationship that's being presented here, is presented simply because the underlying database contains information about primary key and foreign key relationships. So there's a foreign key constraint in the film table on the director ID column, which means it can only accept a value that's already existing in the director ID column of the director table. Again, if that's something you want to know a little bit more about, and you want to know a little bit more about how joins work, then we have videos that explain all of that, of course. So we've got a video about writing joins in our SQL Server Queries tutorial, and there's also, of course, a video that's all about specifically the Wise Owl Movies database, so it explains all of the built-in relationships in the database we're using for this video series. All I need to do at this point then is start checking boxes next to the columns that I want to return. So let's say I wanted to return the full name of my director. There's a full name column there that I can place a check in. You see that each time you select something, it's just automatically written into this little part of the designer, the third panel here. It's also included in the list of columns I've selected. If you want to see what the results of that query were, at any point you can choose to run the query or execute it with a little red exclamation mark button, and that will present you with the results of the query. So lots of Steven Spielbergs currently. It would be nice to see which film Steven Spielberg has made, so if I check the title column next to the, or the title box next to the title column in the film table, and then execute the query again, it'll show me the names of the films that Steven Spielberg has made. There's no need to execute the query each time you make a change. Let's just add in a few more columns. For instance, we can add in the release date, and I can scroll down a little further and we can add in, let's say, the runtime in minutes, and perhaps, let's say, the Oscar wins as well. That's quite a topical one based on the date. We just had the Oscar winners announced yesterday. So I've made a few more changes there. I can click the run button again just to check what results I get, and that's looking like a fairly sensible looking set of data. Once I've finished choosing columns and I'm happy with the results of my query, I can click the OK button on the Query Designer dialog box to return to the main dialog box, and all that will have happened at this point is that the query I've generated will have been written out in full into the query box. Now there's absolutely nothing to stop you from writing that out yourself from scratch, but how much more convenient is it to use the Query Designer to do that? Even if it feels a bit like cheating to begin with, I think you'll become very comfortable with the Query Designer dialog. Once I've finished doing that, I can happily click the OK button, and that will present me with my new dataset with the list of columns available to it. Now you can edit the queries of your datasets at any time simply by right-clicking on the dataset and then choosing either Query or Dataset Properties. It doesn't matter whether you chose to create your query either by writing it out from scratch or using the Query Designer. If I choose to view dataset properties, what that will do is take me back to the main dialog box, and then I could subsequently either type in a new query or edit the query, or click Query Designer. Alternatively, I would just cancel from this dialog box. If I wanted to go straight to the Query Designer, I could right-click on a dataset name and then choose Query, and that would just launch the Query Designer. Now it really doesn't matter which way around you do this, and even if I created my query initially using a basic freehand, just writing out my query, I could right-click on the film data dataset and choose Query to launch the Query Designer, and that would try to populate the Query Designer with the options that I've selected. So I could then select another couple of columns. Let's choose the Oscar wins, and then click OK, and you'll see that this time I've added the Oscar wins column to the film data query. If I right-click on the film data query or dataset and then choose to view its properties, you'll see that that has also been added into the select statement, and it's actually reorganized the code here as well a little bit, having used the Query Designer. I can do exactly the same sort of thing using my other datasets. So if I just cancel from this dialog box, I could right-click Film and Director Data, and then rather than choosing Query, I could choose Dataset Properties. And I could then choose to add in another column. I could either type in a comma here at the end and say something along the lines of, let's say, film.Oscar nominations. So that was one of the other columns available. And if I spell that properly, that will actually work. So it's nominations, not nominations. And if I click OK on the dialog box, that will add in the Oscar nominations column to my dataset. Now, of course, the main point of creating a dataset is to display the information that it contains in some kind of visualization in the report. So that could be a basic table or some kind of fancy looking chart or a map or something along those lines. So just to demonstrate how that works, I'm going to right click into the background of my report and then choose to insert just a basic table to begin with. When I've inserted my table, I then have to assign fields from one of my datasets to the table. Now, there's various different ways to do that. We're going to talk about tables in a lot more detail in one of the later videos in this series. But one simple way to get started is I could simply click and drag a column from one dataset into this table. So if I were to click and drag, say, the title column from the film data dataset into the first column of my table, I'll assign that item to the table. So that means that now that table is fixed to using the film data dataset. If I were to try to include the full name column from my film and director data dataset, I'll find that I'm not allowed to do that. Each table can only use one single dataset. If I wanted to change that, I could do. If I click OK on the dialog box, I can view the tablix properties of this table. So making sure that I've clicked into at least one single cell, I can right click on any of the grey boxes around the outside of the table and choose to view its tablix properties. And then you'll see that the dataset name that's currently assigned to this one is film data. If I change that so that it says film and director data and then click OK, because there's already a column called title in that table, no problems, I can now start to assign other fields from that dataset to this table as well. So of course that restricts me the opposite way around, of course. I can't add a column from the film data dataset to this table now because I can only add columns from the film and director data dataset. So let's click OK, and then let's just finish off this table by adding in, let's say, the Oscar wins to that particular table as well, and maybe one more. Let's have the runtime in minutes. I can add another quick table side by side with this one, so I'm going to right click again into the background of the report and choose Insert Table, and then I'm going to add some columns from my film data dataset this time. An alternative way to achieve this, rather than clicking and dragging from the report data window, is just to hover the mouse cursor over one of the table cells and then use the field selector button that appears. If I click onto that little field selector, I then get a list of data sources that belong to the report. This happens if I've got more than one dataset in the report, by the way. If I've only got one single dataset, I just get a list of columns that are available. But now I can choose which particular dataset I want to use. So in this case, it will be the film data dataset. I can choose title, and then let's go for, let's say, the release date, and maybe just one last column, let's say Oscar wins, just for something quick and simple. So at any point I wanted to check what this report looked like, I can happily just preview the report. So I click the preview tab at the top. That will show me the results once the report is finally loaded, and that will show me the list of films for each of these two different datasets. Now, it isn't the easiest thing to see here because of the different row heights between my two different tables, but you can hopefully see that the order of the films in the different tables is different. So in the table that's related to my film and director data, the order is actually grouped by director, so I get all the Steven Spielberg films first, and then scrolling down that will move on to the next director in the database for that director's films. Whereas the order of results in this dataset, the basic film data one, is based on just the order that the films appear in the film table. And that's not a problem. I can change the order of the results in any table in a variety of different ways. But if I switch back to the design view, one neat simple way to do this is just to assign a sort order to the underlying data source. Or sorry, beg pardon, the data set, not data source. So I can do that in a couple of different ways. Let me right click on my film data dataset and then choose Query to launch the Query Designer again. In the middle part, or roughly the middle part of this dialog box, I get a little grid showing me a list of all the columns that I've selected. So what I could do at this point is choose from the sort type column. Let's sort my films by title, so I'll sort them in ascending order of title. When I've done that and I click OK, what we'll see when I run the report this time is that the table that is based on my film data dataset has all of its rows sorted alphabetically, so I'll get the numeric values first, followed by A and B, etc. I can do the same thing with my film and director data dataset too. If I switch back to the design view, I can right click on that dataset, and this time I'm going to choose Dataset Properties. Rather than using the Query Designer, again, if I know how to write SQL code reasonably well, I can just add a manual order by clause. So here I'm going to say order by film.title, and I can optionally add ASC to indicate that it's in ascending order rather than descending, but that is optional. Ascending is the default anyway. So if I click OK and then preview the report again, we should see that this time both tables are listed in the same order. Now, I didn't need to do this on the datasets. I could have added a sort order to the tables themselves, but I'll talk about that in a bit more detail when we talk about the tables video. Now, although you're safe to make certain changes to your datasets once you've created items in a report, other things should be avoided. So for instance, let's have a quick look. Maybe I'm bored of having these column names runtime minutes and Oscar nominations. Perhaps I think they're too long. There are a couple of different ways I could modify those names. One way is to assign an alias to each column. So what I could do to make that work is by right-clicking on Film and Director Data. I could choose to view the query, or I could write this out in the Dataset Properties dialog box, but it's probably slightly easier to do in the Query Designer. So I'm going to choose Query this time. Runtime minutes, if I can find that column in this part of the dialog box, the grid of columns, there's a column next to the column called alias. How many times can I say the word column in a sentence? So there's the column showing me the actual underlying field name or column name from the database, runtime minutes. If I wanted to give this an alias, I could just call this one length, for instance, by typing in the alias length. What I can then do maybe for the Oscar nominations is change that so it's just called something simple like Oscar noms. You'll notice that when I press enter that's indicated in the select statement. You might just about be able to make this out. With an alias, it says as Oscar noms after the Oscar nominations column and as length. And again, I could have written that out happily in the query dialog box rather than using the query designer. If I now click OK, you'll see that hopefully in the list of fields in the dataset, I've got a length column and an Oscar noms column. The problem that I've got in my particular report is that I've already referenced the runtime in minutes column. That's going to give me an issue when I choose to preview the report. If I choose to preview it, I'm going to get an error message appearing saying that the value expression for the text box runtime minutes refers to a field runtime minutes, and it then complains that that field doesn't exist basically in the current context. So what I need to do here is back in the design view, I can exchange runtime minutes for the length column instead. It doesn't change the title that was originally added, so I could modify that manually by just editing the text in the table. So I can just type over that with the word length, and then if I were to run the report again or preview the report, now everything's happy again. So that's just one thing to be careful of. Be careful of changing the names of columns after you've used that column already in the report. You'll see a similar sort of effect if you choose to delete a dataset that's already been used in an object in your report. So let's say, for example, we don't really need both a film data and a film and director data dataset. I created those two just to show you the two different ways, essentially, to create your basic text queries. Let's delete the film data dataset by right-clicking on it and choosing delete. Now if I choose OK to do that, of course the table that I used, or that I based on that original dataset, still exists, but if I choose to preview the report, of course that's not going to work. This time the complaint is slightly shorter and slightly easier to understand. It's complaining that this table, called tablix2, refers to an invalid dataset named film data. Obviously, we know why that's happened. So back to the design view, one thing I could do is modify the dataset that this table points to. So I could view the tablix properties. If I right click into one of the grey boxes around the outside and choose tablix properties, I could then add a different dataset name, film and director data, and as long as that table or that dataset contains the correct column name, so title, release date and Oscar wins, that table will now work. If I preview the report again, because those columns exist in both datasets, or at least in the film and director dataset, the table will still work. Back into the design view, again, there's not much point in having both tables in here. They're both displaying the same data now, so let's have a quick go at deleting that table. If I select the table and then just press the delete key on the keyboard, that will now be gone. And I've got a bit more room now to display my one single table showing the film titles and the director names, Oscar wins and length. All of the other useful things that you can do with your query that populates a dataset are related to the things you can do in a standard SQL select statement. So again, if you wanted to know a bit more about how select statements work, this is what this SQL Server Queries series is all about. I'm not trying to sell you anything here, by the way. This is completely free, so you're welcome to watch this or not. It really doesn't matter too much. You don't need to know this. It helps to know a little bit at least about SQL select statements when you're working with reporting services. But again, you've always got this query designer to fall back on as well. So let's say, for instance, that I wanted to modify this query so that it only showed films that had won at least one Oscar. So I want to eliminate all the non-Oscar winning films from the list. Quick preview, just have a quick check that we do indeed return some data that has films with no Oscar wins. I want to eliminate those ones. So back into the design view, I can do this in a couple of ways, of course. Again, I can either just edit the query directly in the Dataset Properties dialog box. Alternatively, I could use the Query Designer, and that's what I'm going to do here. So if I launch the Query Designer, and I can find my Oscar wins column, you'll find there's a filter column in this grid down towards the bottom. So Oscar wins, and then there's a filter column into which I can type in basic criteria. So I can type in a greater than or equal to 1, which means that in order to return a result, the row must have a value of Oscar wins that is at least 1, of course. If I enter that by clicking into a different box in this grid, then you'll see that I add a where clause to my select statement. It's important where that sits. It's very important that it comes in between from and order by. So the order of a select statement is vital. You can't mix and match the order of your statements. So I've got my where film Oscar wins is greater than or equal to 1. If I click OK on the dialog box and then preview the report, we'll find that those items have been completely eliminated. They're not even brought through into the report in the first place. You can add as many different criteria as you like to your where clause. So let's say, for example, that I only want to show films with a minimum runtime as well as a minimum number of Oscar wins. Let's say I want to eliminate films with a runtime of, say, less than 180 minutes, so I'll get a much shorter list of films. Let's head back to the design view, and I'm going to right-click on my dataset and then choose Query. And if I find my runtime minutes column in the grid at the bottom, head to the filter column over there and say greater than or equal to 180. If I click into a different cell in the grid, you'll see that it adds an extra criterion combined with an AND operator. So both of these two criteria must be met in order for a film to be returned into the dataset. If I click OK and then just preview the report again, I ought to end up with a much shorter list of films. So those are some of the very basic things that you can do to populate a dataset based on the results of a simple SQL select statement. And of course, the more you know about writing SQL select statements and the more you work with a query designer, the more elaborate sets of data you'll be able to create. What I'd just like to do to move on to the next part of the video is deploy this report, or at least this report project, to the report server so that we can see what it looks like when it's running. So what I'm going to do is cancel out of this dialog box, and then I'm going to first of all find out the URL of my report server. This is something we've done in a couple of previous videos in this series, so apologies if you know how to do this already, but I'm going to head straight to my start menu and find SQL Server Management Studio. So it's this I've got a little shortcut for this in my start menu, SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to run this as an administrator. I'm going to right click and choose More and then Run as Administrator, and then choose Yes to allow the application to make changes. When it launches, what I'm going to do is connect to a reporting services server. So when the application launches, making sure I've got reporting services selected from the drop down list at the top, and making sure that I'm connecting to the same instance, the instance of SQL Server that I would like to deploy my reports to, SQL 2016 training. If I click connect, it shouldn't take too long. What I'll end up with then is a node at the top of the Object Explorer window, which I can right click on and then choose Properties. And then I can select the URL in the middle of the dialog box and copy that to the clipboard with Ctrl and C, then cancel from that dialog box. I can then head back to my Movies report project. I'm just going to close down report number 1 at this stage. All the changes have been saved already, having previewed the report. So I'm going to then right click on my Movies project at the top of the Solution Explorer, choose Properties, and then paste in my report server URL into the target server URL dialog box. I'm then going to click OK. Now currently I won't be able to deploy my report simply because I'm not running this application as an administrator at the moment. So what I'm going to do next is close down Visual Studio altogether, saving the changes to my entire solution. And then I'm going to head back to the Start menu and right click on Visual Studio, choose More, Run as Administrator, and choose Yes to allow that to make changes. When the application loads again, what I would like to do is open up the previous project that I was just working on. A quick simple way to do that is using the recent list. So I'm going to click the Movies link on the recent list on the left hand side, and then when that launches, what I ought to be able to do at this point now is deploy the entire project to the report server. So once again I can right click on the Movies project name and choose Deploy. I should get a little output window popping up telling me that it's deploying things to my report server, and hopefully it will end up by saying 1 succeeded, 0 failed. Now I'd just like to have a very quick look at what that report looks like via the Report web portal application. So to do that I need to view it in a web browser, and I'll need to know the URL of the Report web portal. One way to find that out is using another configuration tool called the Reporting Services Configuration Manager. So back in the Start menu I can run this application and click Yes to allow it to make changes. Make sure I'm connecting to the correct instance, which in my case is SQL 2016 Training. Click Connect. Then there's a web portal URL page on the left hand side which I can click on. I'd like to be able to copy this to the clipboard, but there's no apparent way to do that. I can't right click and copy, and I can't Control C. I can't select the text to copy it. So what I can do is just click onto the link, which will try to browse me to the home page of my web portal, but then I'll be told that I can't load the folder contents. Again, this is for similar reasons, for the reason I couldn't deploy the report in the first place. I wasn't running the application as an administrator. So what I'm going to do, and again, you may well have seen me do this in previous videos, apologies if you're bored of seeing me do this at this point. I'm going to copy the URL, and then I'm just going to head to the Start menu. I'm going to choose another browser, it doesn't matter which one. Right click Internet Explorer, choose More, Run as Administrator, click Yes. When it loads, I can then paste the URL into the address bar, hit Enter to browse to it, and finally I should see my Movies folder. So this Movies folder represents my entire project, and if I click into the folder it will show me all of the objects which belong to that project. If I click Report 1, it will show me all the data that that dataset currently loads from that query. So nothing particularly complicated there. The nice thing about having this basic embedded dataset is that everything's self-contained in a single individual report. So all the things that this data source, all the things that this report needs are contained within the report itself. It's got an embedded data source and an embedded dataset. Now, although embedded datasets work perfectly well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. If you had lots of different reports to create, all of which were reliant on exactly the same set of query results, it would be really tedious to have to recreate that exact same dataset every single time you wanted to create a new report. Equally tedious would be having to update that dataset in every single individual report if you needed to make changes to it. So one potential solution to that sort of problem is something called a shared dataset. And as the name suggests, a shared dataset can be used by multiple reports. Shared datasets aren't the only solution to this sort of problem, by the way. You can solve this problem from the SQL Server side. You could create perhaps a view, or you might create a stored procedure if you know how to write stored procedures and you have permissions to do so. Those are probably slightly more elegant approaches to this particular problem. But assuming that you don't have permission to create stored procedures, or you simply don't know how, then we're going to have a quick look at how you generate a shared dataset which will be used in multiple different reports. So let's have a go going back to our Movies report project, and then I'm just going to close down the output window. And what I'm going to do next is create a brand new blank report. First of all, I'm going to right click my reports folder and then choose Add and then choose New Item. Choose Report. I don't care about changing its name, it can remain as Report 2, and then click Add. Now, in order to create a shared data set, you first of all must have a shared data source. You can't create one without the other. You can't base a shared data set on an embedded data source because, of course, that's only available to a single report. So let's start by creating a shared data source. I can right-click on the Shared Data Sources folder in the Solution Explorer and choose Add New Data Source. And appreciate that we've done this in the previous video in the series, so apologies again if you've seen how to do this already, but it's a nice little refresher. So let's call this one Movies Shared. And then I'm going to spell that properly first of all, and then use the edit button to refer to or build my connection string. So my server name is again ./SQL 2016 training. I could have also typed in localhost there as well instead of the full stop. And then from the drop down list I can simply select my movies database. Hit test connection if you want to reassure yourself. Click OK, OK, OK. And there's my shared data source now created. Now I can create my shared data set, and to do that I need to right click on my shared datasets folder and choose Add New Dataset. I'll need to select a shared data source. Well, I don't actually need to select it because there's only one available, so that's been pre-selected for me. So what I can now do is just change the name of my dataset. So let's call it Film Data Shared. Or DAT shared, let's call it Film Data Shared as I intended. Then again I can either write out my query or I can use the Query Designer to build it. Let's use the Query Designer. I'm going to create or use a few different tables in this case. I'm going to use the Add Table button, and I'm going to include, let's say, my certificate table, the country table, let's say the film table, and the genre table as well. Then I can close down that dialog box. I'm going to check the certificate column, the country column, the genre column, then I'll have the title from the film table, and I'm also going to have things like the release date and the runtime in minutes and the Oscar wins as well. I can apply any of the other settings that I showed you briefly earlier on. I can create aliases for the columns, I can apply sorting and filtering to get exactly the set of data that I need. And again, the more experience you have with writing select statements, the more you'll be able to do with this particular query. At this stage all I'm going to do then is click OK and then click OK again, and that's my basic shared data set now created. To make use of that shared dataset now, I've got to create a reference to it in my report data window of the report that needs to use it. So in this new blank report, I can right-click the Datasets folder and choose Add Dataset. It defaults to a shared dataset here, and you'll see that it's populated with a list of all of the shared datasets in this project. Let's call this one Ref2 Film Data. And then I can simply click OK. There's nothing else. Oh, sorry, I need to actually select. I do this frequently. I often click OK without actually physically selecting the shared dataset. So don't forget to do that. Click the film shared dataset and then click OK. And you'll see that it simply gets populated with a list of all of the columns you originally defined. From this point on, everything else is exactly the same. I could even create embedded datasets alongside the shared one in the same report, but there's no real need for this particular example. Let's create a simple table in this particular report, and I'm going to change the various columns. Let's have title and country and certificate, and let's have the genre column as well. Let's just drag that in, and I'll have the release date and runtime minutes and Oscar wins, so all the columns. Quick bit of changing column widths just to try to make things look reasonably presentable. I'm not sure I'll succeed. I'm going to right click on my release date cell here just to apply a basic date format as well. So if I right click release date and then choose text box properties, and again I'm going to do a lot more on this sort of thing in the later videos in the series on working with tables. I can choose number and then date and then choose a basic simple date format. And then let's have a quick look. Let's just change that column width as well so I can see the entire title in one single row. I'll get there eventually. And then one last thing to do is, let's see, I'm going to run this report just to preview it, just to make sure it looks reasonably sensible, and that will produce a simple set of results. Okay, so that looks okay. Let's head back to the design view. Now, of course, the beauty of having a shared dataset is that you can use it in as many different reports as you like. So let's close down report number 2 and create another inventively titled report. You've guessed it, report 3. So I can right-click reports, add new item, and then choose report and click add. This time let's create a basic chart of our film's data. So I'm going to right-click my Datasets folder and choose add dataset. I'm going to change this name so it's called Ref2 Film Data. And don't forget to click on the film data shared dataset and then click OK. I can then insert a basic chart into the report, so I can choose insert chart, and then let's have a basic, let's have a stacked column chart. So the second one along here, stacked column, and then I can click OK. If I were to then click somewhere inside the report, let's have category groups based on the film genres. Then let's have some series groups based on the film certificates. And finally, let's have some values based on a count of the film titles. So if I select the title column there, I'll just change the width of that report so it can hopefully be a little bit more readable. It won't look beautiful, but none of my reports ever do. But there we go, we've got some basic data there with a simple key, hopefully showing you the basic breakdown. It would be nice if we could see the individual genre titles below the bottom of each column rather than one sort of every 5 columns. So let's head back to the design view, and I'm just going to make a quick simple change here. I'm going to select one of my headers or column titles like genre A, right click and choose horizontal axis properties. From the dialog box that appears, what I can then do is change the interval property from auto. I can just overtype that with the number 1. So I'll get one label for each individual column. If I preview the report again, I ought to get a proper title for each individual column. So that makes it a little bit more readable. One last little report, I think. I'll close down report number 3, and then let's add a new report, or add a new item, which will inventively be called report 4, of course. Click add, then again right click datasets, add dataset. I don't need to change its name, I'm not going to bother changing its name this time, just choose film data shared and click OK. And this time I'm going to add in a basic matrix, so I'm going to right click, insert matrix. I'm going to have the genres listed down the left hand side, and across the top columns I'm going to list out the certificates, and in the data area I'm going to display the title. Now I don't want to actually display the film titles, I want to find how many film titles there are for each combination of genre and certificate. So I can click onto the word title there, and then right click onto it, choose summarize by, and then choose count. If I click away from that and just give the report a quick simple test, I'm not going to waste any time formatting anything. This is just purely to demonstrate that I can create multiple different reports showing different visualizations based on exactly the same set of data without having to recreate it every single time. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to close down report number 4 and save any changes if it asks me to. And then we need to think about how you can deploy these reports using your shared datasets. Hopefully it stands to reason that you can't deploy a report based on a shared dataset unless that shared dataset has also been deployed. And hopefully it also stands to reason that because a shared dataset is based on a shared data source, you have to deploy that as well. So just to demonstrate what I mean by that, if I try to deploy either report 2, 3 or 4 individually, if I right click and then choose deploy, what I ought to get is a warning message saying that it can't deploy that because the shared dataset doesn't exist. So I'm going to click on the error button there and then close down the error list and output windows. What I need to do is deploy the shared dataset, and before I can do that I need to deploy the shared data source. So in this case it makes more sense, rather than deploying each thing individually, just to deploy the entire project again. So I can right click on my movies project and then click deploy, and then that should show me that it's deploying the shared data source. Beg pardon, let's just scroll it. So it's deployed the shared data source, it's deployed the shared data set, and then each of the reports. That includes the one that I've already deployed, so that one will have been overwritten. Just on the subject of overwriting items, it's worthwhile mentioning that were I to choose to deploy the project again, or try to deploy either the data source or the shared data set, then this time I'd end up with simple little failures. So you can see I've got two little warnings here in the output window. Just scrolling up, it's going to tell me that it couldn't deploy the shared data source or the shared data set because I've not allowed that to happen. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you don't want to overwrite your shared data source and shared data set. Once they've been deployed initially, you don't want to overwrite them. You might have local versions of those shared data sources and data sets for developing reports, but when you deploy things, you just want to deploy the actual reports themselves, and they'll rely on the server copy of the shared data source and data set. If you do want the ability to overwrite your shared data source and data sets, let's say for example you wanted to make a change to this data set, I could right click on it and I could choose to open it, and then that would open up the dialog box that would allow me to make changes. So let's say for example I just wanted to add in an extra column. If I go back to the query designer and let's check the budget dollars column, just so I can see how much each film cost, and then I can click OK and OK again. If I were to open up, say, report 2 at this point, I'll see that in the datasets list that the budget column hasn't actually appeared. So to make that work, what I could do is double click on the dataset to display the dataset properties. I could have just right clicked on it to view dataset properties and then choose refresh fields and then click OK. At that point I now get access to the budget dollars column. So this time I've made a change to my shared dataset that I wanted to deploy or redeploy to the server. So in order to make that work, if I close down report number 2 and click yes to save the changes, what I now need to do is make sure that that dataset can be overwritten. So I can do that by right clicking on my movies report project, choosing properties, and then there are a couple of different properties here for allowing us to overwrite datasets and overwrite data sources. I haven't made any changes to my data source, so it's pointless trying to overwrite that. That already exists on the server. But I do want to overwrite my data set, so let's set that overwrite datasets property to true from false, click OK, and then I can right click on the movies project one more time and choose deploy again. So this time I ought to end up with, once it's finally done, as it is going through, and what will happen this time is it will deploy the shared data set again. So it's saying I can't deploy the data source because we didn't allow that to happen, of course, so I only get one warning this time rather than 2. So it can't deploy the data source, I didn't need to do that, but it's deployed the data set and all 4 reports. Okay, so let's go and have a look at what our reports and our shared data sources and data sets look like on the report web portal. If I switch back to Internet Explorer, and then I'll need to refresh my page. If I browse back to the home page, it shouldn't have refreshed yet. So what I can now do is either press F5 or click on the refresh tool at the top, and what will happen at that point is I'll end up with not just a movies folder containing all the reports, but also a shared data sources and shared data sets folder. So we saw the shared data sources folder on the previous course. If I click on the shared data sources folder and look at movies shared, that's the only data source. That gives me information about what the data source contains and the connection string and the security credentials, etc. We talked about that in the previous video, so I won't reinvestigate this one at this point. But one nice thing that I can do is view its dependent items. So if I click on dependent items, it shows me all of the items that depend upon that shared data source. One of which, of course, the only one of which, is the film data shared dataset. So if I were to click on that, it will show me all the information about that dataset, all the information that can be displayed, of course. It doesn't actually show the query, of course. But what I can then do is click on the dependent items of that dataset, and that will show me all the reports that depend upon it. It's not absolutely necessary to see all of this, of course. You could have just browsed from the home page either directly into the Datasets folder and viewed the dataset, or directly from the home page into the movies folder and just viewed each individual report. So there's absolutely no reason to view the detailed information about the data source and the dataset, but it's nice to know that it's there. So just to demonstrate that the reports work beautifully once they've been deployed, just as they did when we were previewing them in the report design view, everything just works based on our shared data source. Now hopefully you can see there are several benefits to creating shared data sets. It means you've basically got much less work to do when you've got lots of different reports based on the exact same query results. It is worthwhile bearing in mind that there is one potential issue with using shared data sets. This is actually something that I discovered quite a long time ago from a much earlier video series that I created on SQL Server reporting services. That was back in SQL Server 2008 R2. I produced a series of videos in that, and then we got a couple of comments on the video using subreports that described a problem that they've been having when they were using shared datasets. And I wrote a little blog on this. This is back in 2013, quite some time ago now, nearly 4 whole years ago. So there was an issue with using shared datasets with subreports and parameters, which there's a bit of a description of the problem here in this little blog. Feel free to have a quick read if you're desperately interested. There was a known issue on the Microsoft, posted on the Microsoft issues site. Now apparently, as it turns out, I haven't tested this myself yet, I haven't quite got to that point, but apparently there is still this issue even now in SQL 2016. So somebody's posted this little link just a few days ago, well nearly a month ago I suppose by now. So yeah, 9th of Feb, oh sorry, over a year ago, beg your pardon, at this point. So it's worthwhile bearing in mind that there is a potential issue using shared datasets in a particular scenario when you're using subreports using parameters. Just bear that in mind. There are other solutions for creating shared datasets, or the equivalent of a shared dataset, that we're going to talk about in a later video in the series. My favourite one is to use something called a stored procedure, which you can then reference and will populate as many different reports as you like. But we'll talk about that in one of the later videos. Okay, just to wrap up this video, I'm going to do a tiny little bit of tidying up back in the web portal application. This is completely optional, by the way, you don't need to do this. This is just to leave me with a nice empty clean web portal ready for the next video. So if you want to tidy up, then the simplest thing to do is just delete each of the individual items one by one. So we could simply click the ellipsis button at the top of the movies folder first, the ... and choose to delete that. Rather than doing it folder by folder, you can also delete lots of things in one go by changing the view of the items in the web portal. So if I change the view using the view tool here from tiles to list, what I can then do is simply check boxes next to each individual item and then delete them all in one go. So if I click the delete tool there and choose yes to delete all the items, oops, did I miss the movies one? Beg your pardon. Let's just delete that one separately and click yes again. So that's all of the items gone. I'm then going to switch back to the tiles view, just ready and set up for the next video. Okay, so hope you got some useful things out of this one. Hope you learned a bit more about basic datasets. Appreciate we haven't done much more than generated simple basic select statements at this point. But the next couple of videos are going to show you a couple of slightly different ways to populate your datasets using SQL Server views and SQL Server store procedures. So hope you'll join us for those. Thanks for watching, see you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.